No one knew her real name. There was no introduction, no recorded lineage, no backstory, just a brief phrase. The Queen of Sheba. As if the Quran pack had only cracked open a door, leaving us to step into the shadowed mystery behind it. But she had once walked this earth, and when she entered Jerusalem with a long caravan trailing behind her, camels laden with gold and spices, the silence surrounding her could no longer be dismissed. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. No one had ever seen a woman travel so far, not to wage war, not to seek marriage, but to ask a man renowned for his wisdom. Why did she go? Out of curiosity, politics, or was it something else, something unreachable by power alone? The Quran pack doesn't say, but there's one tiny detail, so small it's easy to miss. Centuries later, Jesus himself spoke of her, not as a symbol of royalty, but as an example for those who know how to seek. He called her the Queen of the South, the one who will rise at the judgment because she left her distant land in search of the wisdom of God. What does that mean? It means that among the thousands who met Solomon, only she was remembered by the Lord. There must have been something very real about her journey, something that anyone who has ever felt empty in the midst of abundance might understand. And if you've ever asked, "Does anyone see me?" then this story is for you. They called that land Sheba, a southern kingdom where the sun scorched both sand and spirit. But within this realm of frankincense, pure gold, and thriving merchant fleets lived a woman who could not be easily satisfied. Even as a child, she was unlike the others. While young girls were taught how to be demure in front of men, she would sit quietly by a window, listening to her father debate scholars. While elders boasted of caravans crossing the desert, she would ask, "Why do we offer gifts to idols that never respond?" Years passed, her father died young, and she rose to power, a queen too young, surrounded by courts of men. Everyone expected her to fail, but Sheba didn't fall under her rule. The kingdom thrived, prospering more than ever before. Her ships sailed farther, her merchants praised her name, and no enemy dared to invade. And yet, there was one thing she could not conquer: the silence within herself. At night, when no one was watching, she lay awake, not from fear of losing the throne, but because of a void that no crown could fill. All the power, all the praise, all the possessions, none of it quieted the ache that asked, "Who am I? Where did I come from? And if everything I have turns to dust, what remains when I die?" No one knew about this longing. During grand banquets, she still smiled, raised her glass, and spoke with sharp wit, but deep down, she felt like a woman seated on a throne whose heart belonged elsewhere. Then one day, while receiving a Jewish merchant, she heard of a king in the north, Solomon, a ruler known not just for his wealth, just for governing well, but for possessing wisdom given by the Lord. They said he could read the heart. He could explain what no one else could. And more than that, he didn't keep his wisdom to himself. She went silent. Could it be? Could there truly be someone somewhere who not only knew how to speak, but how to listen? That night, she stood on the palace rooftop for a long time. The wind carried the scent of the distant sea, and as the moonlight settled into her heavy eyes, she spoke just one sentence: "Prepare the camels. I will go." The journey took months. Her caravan carried not only gold, jewels, and spices, but also sleepless nights and lingering doubts. As they crossed scorching lands and rested beneath starlit skies, she found no peace. Her mind was crowded with thoughts no one had ever answered. On certain nights, the wind would stir the silk walls of her tent, and she'd sit alone holding a worn little journal. Inside were questions she had written since girlhood, questions no one ever wanted to hear, questions the court priests always brushed aside. Do the gods really hear us? Why do the innocent suffer? How can we tell wisdom from clever lies? And if there truly is a God who knows all, does he know me? No answers came. Only the flicker of firelight, the hush of desert wind, and a heart caught between belief and doubt. Once, her closest advisor asked quietly, "Your Majesty, why must we travel so far to hear one man speak? Wisdom already surrounds us here." She didn't turn to him. She simply replied, "I don't need more words. I need the truth." After that, no one asked again. Then one early morning, as the sun broke over the eastern hills, the lead rider halted his horse and shouted, "Jerusalem, we see his city." The queen stepped out of her tent without a word. She gazed at the city for a long time, as if something within her had just awakened. Jerusalem welcomed her with drums, banners, and the wide-eyed stares of thousands, but she paid little attention to any of it. From the moment she entered the city, she knew this place was not what she came for. The one she sought was behind those palace doors, and he, not the city, was the reason for her journey. When she walked into Solomon's court, she did not bow. She was a queen, and she had crossed deserts and seas to be here. Silent, but her eyes carried a quiet challenge. Solomon didn't act surprised. He rose, stepped down from the throne, and greeted her not as royalty, but as if she were an old friend. It was not about formality, it was about respect. No one recorded how long their conversation lasted, but the Quran pack says she came to test him with hard questions, and that Solomon answered everything she asked. Nothing was too difficult for him. It sounds like a contest of riddles, but it was so much more than that. The questions she brought weren't for shallow minds. She didn't ask about politics, profit, or war. She asked the kind of questions only those who've lain awake at night could ask. How do you stay honest when you have the power not to? Why are the weak still forgotten in a kingdom ruled by a just God? Is the loneliness of leadership a kind of punishment? How can I know if the voice inside me is from God or from fear? Solomon didn't answer like a teacher. He listened like someone who understood. He didn't debate. He didn't try to impress. He told stories, stories of when he was young and arrogant, stories of nights when wisdom didn't bring him joy, only tears, stories of moments when he laid his crown aside just to ask himself, "Can I still hear his voice?" She went quiet. This wasn't what she expected. The queen had come to test a king, but in the end, she was the one exposed. All the armor she had worn since childhood, her pride, her defenses, her sharp intellect, no longer protected the wounds hidden beneath. Solomon didn't try to win her over with brilliance. He answered her pain with his own. He didn't just know things, he had suffered. And maybe that was what true wisdom really looked like. Solomon didn't try to win. He simply looked at her without judgment and said, "No one has come from so far just to ask, and no one has asked like you just to see." They sat together for a long time, long after the attendants had left, long after the lamps were dimmed. Two souls remained, not king and queen anymore, just two human beings, people who once believed they had it all and now understood they had only been searching. That night, there were no flutes, no praises sung, no torches flickering in the palace gardens, just the open sky stretched above the rooftop and a woman sitting alone in the wind. No attendants, no crown, only her and the things she couldn't say out loud. Since arriving in Jerusalem, she had never been this quiet. By day, she was sharp, poised, unreadable. But now, with no one left to impress, she found herself face to face with a strange emptiness. And in that stillness, she realized something that surprised even her. She no longer needed the answers. Behind that man, behind his calm, unguarded wisdom, was someone else, a presence she had never named. Solomon may have been wise, but she knew that kind of wisdom wasn't his to claim. It came from a source he dared not own. A source so real that it made her, who had once stood before 100 idols, now tremble before something far greater than logic, beyond understanding, beyond pride. There was no thunder, no flashes of lightning, but something inside her cracked open softly and without resistance. It was like a child who had wandered too far returning home in the night to find the light still on. She looked up to the sky. Once the heavens had seemed like myth, not anymore. She didn't cry, but if someone had walked by, they might have noticed a strange light in her eyes, as if in the deepest part of her she had heard a voice never spoken aloud. "I see you." And so she left the palace that night, but by morning, everyone in the city knew something had changed. The curious glances were gone. The regal arrogance had softened. What remained was a quietness that didn't come from exhaustion but from someplace deeper, where the soul finally stopped struggling. She spoke less, smiled more gently, and when the royal officials in her entourage asked if she had found what she came for, she answered only, "I have heard and I have seen." This was a woman who had once traveled far in search of an answer, but now she no longer needed one, because in the end, what she had found was not an explanation but a presence who knew every question she had ever carried and still loved her even when she hadn't yet admitted she needed him. That morning, before the sun had risen above the rooftops of Jerusalem, the Queen of Sheba's caravan was already stirring. Her servants carefully packed the crates of gold, the jars of fragrant spices, the glittering gems she had once brought as royal offerings. To them, she was just another royal guest who came bearing treasures and left with a few wise sayings. But hidden among the silver and silk, there was a gift no one could measure, a gift unrecorded by scribes, not displayed in any treasury, and impossible to store in the vaults of kings. It was a gift given from the heart. They say that after their final conversation, Solomon became quieter. He no longer debated with the same intensity before foreign delegations. He spent more time in the temple. Some scholars believe that it was after her visit that he began writing words no longer polished and proud, but full of longing, like in Ecclesiastes or the aching love poems of Song of Songs. Ancient scrolls tell a legend that she returned to Sheba carrying new life, perhaps a son, perhaps a daughter. No one knows for sure, but in many East African traditions, she is remembered as the mother of a royal bloodline, one that began with a woman who searched and a man who listened. Was that her real gift? A life born not just of affection but of awakening. Whatever the truth, what she brought to Jerusalem didn't end there. Her truest gift couldn't be held in hand, but it did what no caravan could ever do. It changed a heart. And for those who have traveled far seeking something they can't name and returned with something no one else can see, maybe they understand the deepest things are rarely written down. They are only remembered by those who've been touched by them. She returned as quietly as she had come. Those in her court noticed a difference. She spoke less, rarely joined the lavish feasts, and more often she walked alone through the sunlit courtyards. No one knew if she believed. There was no baptism, no foreign altar erected in the palace, but her choices began to speak for her. Decisions that had once been sharp as swords now flowed gentle as rivers. She pardoned a man once condemned for treason. She commissioned a home for the elderly, the first of its kind in her kingdom. And above all, she began to write, not royal decrees but small personal passages, notes meant perhaps for her child or maybe for future generations. Writings that didn't preach or instruct but quietly told the story of a woman who once had everything and gave it all up to ask a single question. Does anyone see me? Then one day she stopped writing. No one knew why, but from that day on her face seemed lighter, as if she had finally learned something that no longer needed to be said, only lived. Her life itself had become the answer, and the kingdom changed with her in ways no one could explain. Traders from distant lands whispered that Sheba had grown more peaceful, more just, and its people kinder. She had once gone in search of wisdom, but when she returned, she did not carry a teaching. She carried a faith, one without a name, without doctrine, just truth. And that truth was enough to change a nation. Jesus once said, "The Queen of the South will rise at the judgment, for she came from the ends of the earth to listen to the wisdom of Solomon, and now something greater than Solomon is here." He didn't mention her name. He didn't spell out her story, but he remembered her journey, a journey made in silence, unnoticed by most, yet powerful enough to stand as a witness for the world. Because there's a truth many are afraid to admit. We are all searching. Whether seated on thrones or curled up in small, quiet rooms, human beings keep asking deep within, do I get to be seen? Is there someone who hears my quiet sighs? Someone who understands the questions I'm too afraid to speak? The Queen of Sheba dared to ask. She left everything behind to seek something she wasn't even sure existed, and because she did, she encountered the one who had seen her all along. Not everyone can make a journey to Jerusalem, but every longing heart can be answered, not through arguments, but through presence. You don't need every question in your soul resolved. Sometimes all it takes is someone who truly sees you, and that's enough. Many people live their whole lives never being truly seen. But if you've ever been like her, if you've dared to face the emptiness, if you've stepped beyond comfort in search of something real, then maybe, just maybe, this story is for you. Maybe you're a little like her. And if God could see her, then maybe he sees you too. The entire account is detailed in the Quran, chapter 27, Surah An-Naml, the ant, from verse 20 to verse 44. Here are the key verses and their context in English. The beginning, the Hoopoe's report. The story begins when Prophet Solomon inspects his army of men, jinn, and birds, and finds the Hoopoe bird missing. When the Hoopoe returns, it brings astonishing news from the land of Sheba, Saba. Surah An-Naml, verses 22 to 24. But the Hoopoe did not stay away long. It said, "I have learned something you do not know. I have come to you from Sheba with sure news. Indeed, I found a woman ruling over them, and she has been given everything, and she has a mighty throne. I found her and her people prostrating to the sun instead of Allah. And Satan has made their deeds appealing to them and has averted them from the right way, so they are not guided." Prophet Solomon's letter. Upon hearing this, Prophet Solomon sends a letter to the queen, inviting her to submit to the one true God. Surah An-Naml, verses 30 to 31. It is from Solomon, and it reads, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Do not be arrogant before me, but come to me in submission as Muslims." The queen's response and Solomon's wisdom. The queen consults her chiefs and decides to send gifts to Solomon to test him. Prophet Solomon rejects the gifts, demonstrating that his power comes from Allah. He then asks his assembly to bring her throne to him before she arrives. Surah An-Naml, verse 38. Solomon said, "O chiefs, which of you can bring me her throne before they come to me in submission?" The queen's acceptance of faith. When the queen arrives, she is tested with her own throne, which had been brought to Solomon's court in an instant. Finally, she is asked to enter a palace with a floor made of polished glass, which she mistakes for water. Overwhelmed by the wisdom, power, and signs of God displayed by Solomon, she recognizes the truth and embraces the faith. Surah An-Naml, verse 44. She was told, "Enter the palace." But when she saw it, she thought it was a body of water and uncovered her shins to wade through. He said, "It is a palace paved with smooth glass." She said, "My lord, indeed I have wronged myself, and I submit with Solomon to Allah, the Lord of the worlds."